Okay, in problem 23, the left side is clearly more complicated. So I have a fraction times another fraction, and I'm going to end up just multiplying them. So 1 times 1, that's easy, that's 1. And then in the denominators, I need to FOIL. So I need to multiply 1 times 1 times cosine, negative cosine theta times 1, and negative cosine theta times cosine theta, which is negative cosine squared theta. And then I'm going to bring the right side down. Okay, so I noticed that I had a minus b times a plus b, which is the difference of squares pattern. When you see that pattern, you know that your middle terms will cancel out, and that's good news because it makes everything more simple. So now I have 1 over 1 minus cosine squared theta. Okay, so whenever I see these squareds, I start thinking about my Pythagoreans. So I'm going to pull up my list to see what the Pythagorean identity would be. Okay, so I'm looking at my first Pythagorean, and it says sine squared theta plus cos squared theta equals 1. And I chose that one because that's what I have on my left side. So if I have a 1, I can replace it with sine squared theta plus cos squared theta. Okay, so it's this 1 in the denominator that I want to replace. So I have 1 over, and instead of this 1 right here, I'm going to put sine squared theta plus cos squared theta. And then bring down this minus cos squared theta. And still bring down your right side. Okay, so I do have some things that will cancel out, cos squared and negative cos squared theta. And so now I have 1 over sine squared theta. Okay, now this is one of my reciprocal identities. 1 over sine is the same as cosecant. So now I can do my final step. Cosecant squared theta equals cosecant squared theta. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, we're on problem 45. In problem 45, I have 2 fractions and I want to subtract them. And the only way I can subtract 2 fractions is if I have a common denominator. So the first fraction is missing this part, the 1 plus cosine theta, and the second fraction is missing this part, the 1 minus cosine theta. So I need both of those terms in my common denominator. So I will multiply the first fraction by 1 plus cos theta over 1 plus cosine theta. And I'm allowed to do that because when you multiply by something divided by itself, you're just multiplying by 1, and that doesn't change anything. Okay, so this one's my original fraction, and I'm multiplying it by 1 plus cosine theta over 1 plus cosine theta. Okay, let's bring down this fraction, 1 over 1 plus cosine theta. And this one was lacking the 1 minus cosine theta, so I'm going to multiply by 1 minus cosine theta over 1 minus cosine theta. And then I'll bring down my right side. Okay, so now I have a common denominator of 1 plus cosine theta times 1 minus cosine theta. So I can combine into one fraction. Okay, I have 1 plus cosine theta times 1, so that's 1 plus cosine theta, minus 1 times 1 minus cosine theta. So I'm going to put that in parentheses so I remember to subtract both parts. Okay, I'm going to distribute the minus to both of these terms. So I have 1 plus cosine theta minus 1 plus cosine theta. And then bring down my denominator. Notice that even though it's a lot of writing, you have to write all of the parts in every step. You can't take a shortcut and just write the part that you changed. Okay, so 1 minus 1, those cancel. 1 and negative 1. But the cosine and the cosine, that makes a 2 cosine. So I have 2 cosine theta on top. On the bottom, I'm going to multiply. 1 times 1, 1 times negative cosine, cosine theta times 1, and cosine times negative cosine gives me minus cos squared theta. Okay. So now cosine theta and negative cosine theta cancel out, and I have 2 cosine theta over 1 minus cosine squared theta. So again, I have this cosine squared in my denominator, and I want to use a Pythagorean substitution here. So I'm going to change my 1 more time. I'm going to change that to sine squared theta plus cos squared theta. So I'm going to copy my numerator to cosine theta, and then the 1 becomes sine squared theta plus cos squared theta, and then minus cos squared theta. Okay, so these two cancel out, and I have 2 cosine theta over sine squared. So let's take a minute to look at what we're trying to make. This 2, I see it right here, so I'm just going to pull that out. The 2, I'm going to pull it out front. Cosecant I know is 1 over sine, and cotangent I know is cosine over sine. So I'm going to take my sine squared in my denominator and break that into 2 separate sines. Sine theta and sine theta. So the cosecant part, that's 1 over sine theta. And the cotangent part, that is this cosine here over one of these sines. So I took my 2 cosine theta over sine squared. I pulled the 2 out front. The cosine is here, and the sine squared is sine times sine. So I just pulled this into 3 different pieces because I looked at what I was trying to make. So now the 2 is still there. This one becomes the cosecant, and this one becomes the cotangent. Okay, let's do one more before we switch to the next video. Okay, 53 is another common denominator problem, and I want you to remember to try this problem now that you know the strategy of common denominator before you watch this one. So the first fraction is missing the 1 plus cosine theta, so I'm going to put 1 plus cosine theta over 1 plus cosine theta. Alright, bring down my second fraction. And this one is missing the 1 minus cosine theta. Okay, so in my numerator I have 1 plus cosine theta and plus and 1 minus cosine theta. My denominator is a common denominator of 1 plus cosine theta times 1 minus cosine theta. This time my cosine and negative cosine cancel out, so my numerator is just 2. My denominator, I know that my middle terms are going to cancel out, so I'm just going to take that shortcut. I know 1 times 1 is 1. Cosine theta and negative cosine theta, those are going to cancel out. And then cosine times negative cosine is minus cos squared theta. Okay. One more time, I'm going to do a Pythagorean substitution for the 1. So this 2 comes down. Instead of 1, I write sine squared theta plus cos squared theta. And I still have minus cos squared theta. So those cancel. And I have 2 over sine squared theta. So what I'm going to do is take the 2 out front. 2 times 1 over sine squared theta. So now my 2 is out front just like over here. And finally I have 2 cosecant squared theta equals 2 cosecant squared theta. And give yourself a check. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video and we'll start again on the next video.